Hello. Welcome to the second lecture of our course on Prajnaparamita. Happy to have you with me today. The Prajnaparamita, that is, perfection of wisdom text, can be said to form a family, in that a group of texts in a variety of formats emerged over time, maintaining consistent similarities and ideas even while undergoing change. In the previous lecture, there was a discussion of how this family can be seen within the cultural sphere of Buddhism. Although it has been suggested that the Vajracchedika Prajnaparamita, known in English as the Diamond Sutra, may have been the earliest, the primary sutra seems to me to have been the so-called 8,000 line version of the Sanskrit. I'll discuss this matter in more detail later. Now, there are many manuscripts of Buddhist sutras that have no title. Some just begin with the opening word, Shri. We can understand that having hundreds of documents without titles would be very confusing. But the question that challenged the redactors of the text, or those who made copies, was what title to give the document. In the Prajnaparamita family, where texts have similarity of content, one solution was to simply count the lines and identify the versions by measuring length. This can work for cataloging text, and so we can see Sanskrit titles of the sutras that had thousands of lines, 8,000, 10,000, 18,000, 25,000, and 100,000. From this perspective, we can understand why the 8,000 line version is a likely candidate for the oldest, and thus the primary one of this grouping. It formed the basis for all the expanded versions that had more lines added, but all of them replicate the 8,000 line structure and sequencing. As the written texts move through Inner Asia to China, we have examples of what we call witnesses. That is, examples which are used to study the documents. Each surface had individual physical features, and thus the written examples on palm leaves, birch bark, and Chinese paper give us some idea of how varied the formations were. Now, the Chinese translations do not use line length as titles. In the case of the 8,000 and 25,000 line versions, they simply distinguish the two as short and expanded. The 100,000 line one was referred to only as the Great. In other cases, such as the first Chinese translation of the 8,000 line version, the title was taken from the one given to the first chapter. Thus, the second century translation is called Dao Xing Jing, the practice of the path, the title of the first chapter. This opens up yet another question. about how the documents were put together. Who made the chapter divisions? On what basis was this division made or constructed? If the text had an oral beginning, were chapter divisions of any use? Was the chanting of the text done with pauses in the recitation? Are the chapters independent units that were pulled together by redactors rather than pauses? Did reciters have their special memorized unit? And were these later combined as chapters of a written text, with each one given an identifying title? Now, I'm using the word redaction in the sense of putting something into writing. A redaction may be made up of oral teachings that are selected by a redactor and made into a written text. Now, the teachings cannot be precisely dated by the redaction. There can be a long oral tradition that is beyond our scope of knowledge from available data. While our earliest example of the redaction of the 8,000 was 1st century of the Common Era, that is not the date of the content, which was earlier. Now, when the Prajnaparamita was introduced into China, the teachings had already been redacted, that is, put into written form. The 8,000 line version is the oldest extant documented version. A fragment of the 8,000, written in Kharoshthi script, has been carbon dated to the 1st century CE. In its fully developed form, it was taken to China and translated in 179 of the Common Era by a Parthian monk, Lokakshema. He came to Chang'an and belonged to the community of monks from Inner Asia as well as India. These monks had traveled across the caravan routes from the subcontinent over the Pamir Mountains and through the Taklamakan Basin in association with merchants. Now, in Lokakshema's translation, we can see that the primary sutra, 8,000 lines, was a mature literary documentation of religious ideas. It was a sizable text. Its English translations covering over 200 pages. Now, my joint translation of the 5th century version with Professor Matthew Osborne of Oxford University has been made available to you in draft format. It will be published by the Numata Foundation series in Tokyo and Berkeley by the end of this year. As already mentioned, it is written as a dialogue between the Buddha and the other arhats who were his disciples, as well as with devas who join with humans to hear the teaching. A number of the chapter divisions may have been constructed by collecting teachings based on the audience. That is, whether these teachings were being given to arhats or to Shakra and the devas or to thousands of bodhisattvas. A second and larger version appeared, which is called the 25,000 line sutra, Panchavimshati Prajnaparamita Sutra. Its length is nearly 3 times that of the primary sutra. The additions function like an accordion. That is, a passage from the primary text is expanded by adding explanations, giving the full recitation of all the items in a numbered list, rather than just a name from the list. Now, Buddhists often define words by giving a technical term a number, as in 8-fold path, 3 gems, 6 perfections, 10 powers, 5 skandhas. The numbers indicated the components of the concept and were tags to specify exactly which path, which gem, which perfection is being discussed. Now, the numbered list of terms was sometimes referred to by just the name, such as 6 perfections. When the Prajnaparamita text underwent expansion, less abbreviation was used. When possible, the 6 perfections were named and all 6 repeated in each instance. At times, the numbered lists would be explained or commented on, and all of these stratagems lengthened the text, but did not substantially change the structure or content. And finally, the primary text was expanded to 100,000 lines, covering hundreds of pages. But even with such expansion, the basic message remained the same. Monks arriving in the capital of the Han brought these expansions. Chinese pilgrims to India, such as Xuanzang, were pleased to find the longer text. Their reasoning was, the longer the text, the older it was. The thought was later people might abbreviate for convenience, but it was hard to imagine that they would add words to a text seen to be the words of the Buddha. In our understanding of the situation, longer often means younger, that is, a later expansion. The shorter version is felt to be closer to the first redactions. It is this reasoning that has led scholars to assume that the 8,000 came first, the 25,000 next, and the 100,000 as the final one. Xuanzang brought back from his pilgrimage to India the 100,000 line version. It was so large that he needed horses to carry it. The 100,000 line version, when translated into Chinese, took 600 scrolls. Each scroll was made up of 15 pages of paper pasted together, 9,000 pages of manuscript, and later the same number transferred to print. Well, in this class, we'll focus on the primary text of 8,000 lines. The first phase of an ever-expanding text reached such length that these very long sutras were no longer practical documents for chanting. Instead, new formats were made that reduced the sutra to smaller and smaller versions, 500, 700 lines, one page, and finally, one syllable. Now, these concise versions were very successful and soon became the major documents for chanting and rituals. Much merit could be gained from chanting or copying the whole of a sutra. Thus, the shorter was selected over the long. The Diamond and Heart Sutras dominated the ritual life of Mahayana, especially in China and East Asia. The one place where the primary sutra in 8,000 lines remains dominant is in Nepal, among the Newari Buddhist families. Many of them have a prized copy of the Sanskrit version of the 8,000, and at least once a year it is chanted in a household ritual. Perhaps the most chanted text in Buddhism is the Heart Sutra, one page, that attempts to give the essentials of the Prajnaparamita. We'll later in the course review these summary versions and attempt to understand their place in Mahayana practice. Now, the Chinese, as they had done with the primary text, did not put the numbered titles on their translations. Instead, they gave titles that reflected the characteristics of the summaries: heart, diamond, or they identified the main personage in the text, especially Manjushri. It was Manjushri who was identified with wisdom, and thus his appearance in the text is not surprising. One exception to this way of naming is the Heart Sutra, which has Avalokiteshvara as the main figure. However, no one seems to entitle the text with his name. When the system of Tantra, focused on rituals of empowerment, became more dominant, Prajnaparamita remained an important element. Atisha's memoirs from the 10th century tell us that when he went to Palembang in Sumatra to study Tantra, he had to first master Prajnaparamita before moving into the empowerment of dharani and mantras. One of the supporters of the Tantric Buddhist development was the Pala dynasty, and they too held the Prajnaparamita in high esteem. The last example of the use of 8,000 was in the Pala period. And we have some of the most beautiful examples of Sanskrit manuscripts from the Pala, and among them is the 8,000 Prajnaparamita. A final format for this family of texts were metric compositions, where the teachings were expressed in complex and sophisticated meter. There has long been a question about the date and function of the metric version. Now, in textual studies, it's commonly accepted that poetry is the best method to fix and maintain wording over a long period. Prose is the least effective form because changes can be made to prose and there's no indication to the reader that they are seeing an altered text. With metrical statements, any change will immediately stand out as an anomaly, and it requires a very clever redactor to rewrite a passage maintaining exactly the meter of the original. So that's why linguists look to metrical passages for the oldest use of words and syntax and even dialect. But in the case of the metric texts for the Prajnaparamita, it does not appear that they are the oldest. The words and content are of a time when the primary texts were in their final stages of expansion. Rather than an ancient metric text that was transformed to prose at a later date, the Prajnaparamita prose in 8000 has formations that would predate the metric ones. This implies that metric was a form of summation of the essentials of the prose, and thus prose is early and metric is later. In reference to the previous lecture, these four types of Prajnaparamita texts seem to be the products of systems of writing and performance. The primary text was noted for its style of expanding without shifting the structure of the text. Tantric Prajnaparamita texts were formulated to conform more to the empowerment rituals without trying to maintain the structures used in the other sutras. Metrical editions seem to represent a system of expressing the full impact of the teaching through skillful use of words in a structure formatted by meter. Each of these four systems need to be seen within their own agenda. Since the agendas were different, the texts within each of the systems vary in structure and focus and style. Now, in the next lecture, we will begin to explore the 8,000-line version using the English translation as well as the source text of Kumarajiva's Chinese. Thank you very much. Look forward to seeing you next time.